Okay, so here we'll talk about hormone transport, circadian rhythm, how the hypothalamus impacts the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland, and then we'll talk about our first polypeptide growth hormone. So first, let's talk about this term called half-life. I mentioned it, I think, twice when we were talking about binding proteins in part 1, but let's talk about what is half-life. So we read up here, time it takes for a hormone's concentration in the blood to be reduced to half of its peak. So we think about what is 100% of this hormone's value, and then how long does it take to reach 50% of its maximal value. So like coffee has a half-life, or caffeine has a half-life, drugs have a half-life. So it's just how long does it take for that hormone to be reduced to half of maybe its effectiveness. So let's talk about how can we create longer half-lives. Basically, first with half-life again, it just determines the potency. So it determines its potency to produce a signal in the intended target cell. So we're looking at potency. How can we extend the potency of a hormone? The answer of this, you can extend or create a longer half-life by attaching to a binding protein or another molecule in the blood. So this lengthens or extends the half-life. So it makes this cell, or it makes this hormone more effective and more potent, to where its potency is extended until it reaches that target cell. Next question is, how does a hormone degrade? So what causes hormone degradation? So two answers here. First is over time. So hormones just degrade over time, or if they interact with a receptor. So with receptor interaction, the hormone actually breaks down, ending its signal to the body. So structure and function are lost after the hormone attaches to the receptor and exerts its signal. But this is good because it makes the receptor available to now bind another hormone. So hormone degradation over time, or if it attaches to a receptor. So receptor interaction can also cause breakdown of the structure and loss of function. All right, next, another term is called pulsatility. So pulsatility, the release of a hormone in burst or pulses of large quantity. So what's the purpose of this? Oh, here's it is. Benefit. So what is the benefit of pulsatility? Basically, it stimulates more effective hormone signaling, and it can amplify the effect of the hormone at the target cell, making the response greater over time. So again, it just amplifies the effect of the hormone. So making it, again, kind of more potent. We will look at some hormones that have this release. One is insulin and another is growth hormone. Cortisol kind of has a pulsatile release. We'll look at its circadian rhythm later. What is it influenced by? So what influences pulsatility? Normally I would ask y'all this. I would ask y'all this in class and say, hey, like, what do you think determines when a hormone is released in these bursts or pulses? What the answers are for this is exercise intensity. So the intensity of our exercise will influence hormone release, especially in a pulsatile manner. Also, drugs and medication will also interact with certain hormones, causing them to be greater. And then nutritional intake, so our diet influences this. And then the environment, so a cold environment versus hot environment influence pulsatility as well. So these two terms are important to know and need to understand this, but we'll continue to talk about each one of these as we move through our lecture. But let's move on to circadian rhythm. This is a question on your assignment. So what is circadian rhythm? We see it's a 24-hour cycle in the physiological processes of living beings. It basically impacts hormones' response and release at different times throughout the day. So some hormones start low in the morning and then peak later in the day or at night. That would be growth hormone. And then other hormones peak in the morning and then decline steadily throughout the day. That would be testosterone and cortisol. So some hormones have very large fluctuations. Others have very little variability. Others only respond to acute stressors. So every hormone has its own pattern of release. What is this regulated by? The pineal gland or the pineal gland. So pineal gland is a small pine cone shaped structure located deep inside the brain. It produces melatonin. Melatonin regulates our circadian rhythms and sleep. It functions as our biological clock. So it's used, melatonin's used to treat jet lag, seasonal affective disorder, depression, and then insomnia. What other factors influence our circadian response pattern? So light and dark cycles. That has to do with jet lag and then long distance travel across time zones. Sleep patterns, such as lack of sleep, pulling an all-nighter, that also inhibits some hormones and interferes with our circadian rhythm. And then seasonal changes, like environmental changes, so temperature or longer daylight in the summer, and like shorter nighttime or dark, I guess, time periods, that will influence this. And then also physical activity levels will vary as the seasons change. So influencing the time of day that we exercise. So that also influences our circadian rhythm. If you look at this biological clock over here, pretty interesting. If you start at midnight, you go into like our deepest sleep. You go into where our lowest blood pressure is, when our body temperature is lowest, and then when blood pressure starts to rise, melatonin stops. Our highest alertness around 10 noon, and then we see like best coordination, fastest reaction time, and then it just kind of circles back. You see when melatonin starts. But yeah, pretty interesting. But let's watch a few videos.
The pineal gland was given its name because it has a pine cone-like shape. Unlike most brain structures, the pineal gland is unpaired, meaning there is only one. It sits directly on the midline of the brain. The function most linked to the pineal gland is the secretion of a hormone called melatonin, which is best known for its role in regulating circadian rhythms. The pineal gland is made up of secretory cells called pinealocytes, which secrete melatonin throughout the 24-hour cycle. Secretion is highest in the middle of the night. It begins to decrease as it gets closer to dawn and is lowest during daylight hours. This schedule of melatonin secretion is regulated by signals from the retina about light in the environment, which travel to a nucleus in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and then via an indirect route to the pineal gland. The main function of the suprachiasmatic nucleus is to control circadian rhythms, and in addition to sending information about ambient lighting to the pineal gland, the suprachiasmatic nucleus also uses levels of melatonin as a signal to provide information about the time of day. Because melatonin levels are highest during the hours of darkness, melatonin activity can be used as a signal that circadian rhythms should be in their nocturnal stage. If melatonin levels are high and someone is still wide awake, it is an indication circadian rhythms are not in sync. This might happen, for example, after flying across several time zones. In this case, melatonin is used by the suprachiasmatic nucleus as a signal to get circadian rhythms back on track. Due to its close association with nighttime and circadian rhythms, melatonin has also been investigated as playing a role in promoting sleep, but the true relationship between melatonin and sleep is still unclear.
Why do most people get sleepy in the afternoon? Why do they feel alert and energized around 10 in the morning? Well, there is something that guides how we feel throughout the day called the circadian rhythm. This is a rhythm that is naturally occurring and is built into the systems of the human body along with plants and animals. The term circadian rhythm was developed in the 1950s by a man named Franz Halberg, who derived the term from the Latin words circa, which means about, and diem, which means day. Therefore, the word literally translates into about a day rhythm. Even though the term is relatively modern, scientists have been aware of this rhythm for thousands of years. both the Egyptians and the Greeks had some understanding of the circadian rhythm. There are several criteria that a biological circadian rhythm must follow. First, it must last around 24 hours. And second, the rhythm can be reset by exposure to light and heat. This phenomenon can be seen as we travel across time zones and get jet lag as our bodies slowly adapt to the new local time. Recently, it has been concluded that disruptions to our circadian rhythm can cause health problems. Chronic disruptions of the circadian rhythm has been shown to cause fatigue, insomnia, and is at times linked to obesity and diabetes. At this point, you might be wondering, what happens during this 24-hour cycle? What exactly happens during this rhythm? If you take a normal day and break it down from sunrise to sunrise, it may look something like this. In the morning time, our body experiences its sharpest rise in blood pressure and a reduction in the secretion of melatonin. These occurrences cause our bodies to feel awake. It has been recently discovered that enjoying a cup of coffee first thing might be counterproductive to your day. In fact, early in the morning, our bodies have the highest level of a hormone called cortisol, which makes us naturally feel more awake. The caffeine in coffee actually interferes with cortisol production. Your body makes less of it accordingly, and the body then relies more on the caffeine to feel awake. By this logic then, it is better to have a cup of joe in the early afternoon so that the body does not become as dependent on caffeine to feel alert. In the afternoon, our bodies have the best coordination, reaction time, cardiovascular efficiency, and muscular strength. This gives us an explanation as to why so many world records are broken in the late afternoon. In the evening time, our body temperature begins to increase along with the secretion of melatonin, signaling to our bodies that it's nighttime and it's time to go to sleep. We hit our deepest stage of sleep around 2 o'clock in the morning. Using this information is key to living a productive and happy life. After all, it's part of our nature, and the fight against nature is not easily won. Anyways, it's about 5 in the afternoon right now, so I'm going to go ahead and get ready for my afternoon run.
All right, so there's 2 really neat videos on circadian response patterns. There is some research that looks at this on the best time to exercise based on the release of, our melatonin levels. We're morning. Due to high levels of anabolic hormones like testosterone and cortisol, it was suggested that exercise in the morning may be beneficial. And then some argue that exercising at night or in the late afternoon may be better because human growth hormone is going to be highest or start to increase in the late evening. One study also reported that aerobic endurance performance was better in the morning due to increases in cortisol, which is our stress hormone, which kind of helps us wake up and get us moving. But no study has actually declared like absolute priority for a time of day where training response is optimal, unless sleep-wake cycles affect quality of exercise. So there is differing research kind of on when is the best time to exercise. We all probably have our own opinions. I normally ask the class, like, when do you prefer to exercise? Like, what time of day is optimal for you to where you perform your best? And I usually have a lot of different answers. So you can also kind of use your own personal experience with circadian rhythm when answering this question on your assignment. But let's move on to the next topic, which is kind of talking about the pituitary gland and how the hypothalamus has control over this gland and a lot of others. So you see here that I have listed our major endocrine glands of the body. And if you look at this statement down here, the ones in purple are glands that regulate metabolic, regulation. So we're about to talk about the pituitary gland, especially the anterior pituitary gland, and then we'll get into the thyroid gland. We don't talk about the adrenal gland and the pancreas until kind of the end of this lecture. So first, let's start with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. They work on an axis or an axis. So production and release of some hormones require sequential interaction of one or more glands, and that's called an axis. So it's a close relationship between function and coordination of hormones that impacts almost every tissue and system in the body. So this is the most important axis we have in the body. It's the hypothalamus and pituitary gland relationship. So what's the hypothalamus? We already know what this is. So the hormones released from the hypothalamus promote and inhibit the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So if we look closely, we're looking at the brain, we see deep inside the brain is our hypothalamus, which is this part here. And then what hangs down beneath is the posterior and anterior pituitary gland. So very tiny structures. These are considered kind of the master glands in the body because these hormones control kind of everything, all the other glands in the body. So let's look at this here. So pituitary, its hormones function or impact all the functions in the body. It's basically a small gland. It's the size of a pea below the brain or kind of around the limbic system. Has the anterior and posterior parts. So it responds to signals from the hypothalamus to produce and release certain hormones. So controls functions of other glands as well. We've learned previously that the hypothalamus regulates thirst, water balance, temperature, and then endocrine function. And it has control over the pituitary gland. It receives input from the body to control or maintain a set point of regulation. So homeostatic control. So we've referred to our hypothalamus as our homeostatic center. But yeah, so we'll talk about, on the next slide, we'll look at the difference between posterior and anterior pituitary gland.
Pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is a small region situated directly above the brainstem. It is made up of a collection of nuclei with a variety of functions, but in general the hypothalamus is involved in controlling the two H's, homeostasis and hormones. Homeostasis is a term used to describe the maintenance of balance or stability in a biological system. The hypothalamus can maintain homeostasis either by exerting direct influence over the autonomic nervous system or by causing the release of hormones. The hypothalamus manipulates hormone release primarily by controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a hormone-secreting gland that sits just below the hypothalamus. It is sometimes called the master gland because it not only secretes many extremely important hormones, but it also regulates the activity of other hormone-secreting glands throughout the body. The pituitary gland consists of two lobes, called the anterior and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is responsible for the release of a number of hormones that have widespread effects throughout the body. They include growth hormone, which is involved with growth, follicle-stimulating hormone, which plays a role in development and reproduction, luteinizing hormone, which is essential to testosterone production and reproduction, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is involved with the stress and fear responses, thyroid-stimulating hormone, which is important to healthy metabolism, and prolactin, which promotes milk production in females. The release of these hormones is controlled by the hypothalamus, which sends signals in the form of releasing hormones to tell the anterior pituitary when to secrete its hormones. The posterior pituitary also secretes two hormones, but does not synthesize them. Instead, they are synthesized by the hypothalamus and then sent to the posterior pituitary for release into the bloodstream. The names of these hormones are oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin has important roles in facilitating childbirth and lactation, but is also thought to have a role in compassion and social bonding. Vasopressin's main functions are to control urine output and regulate blood pressure.
All right, so just one more recap on what hormones are controlled by the hypothalamus. So we already know it controls secretion from pituitary. So just like the video mentioned, growth hormone, and then gonadotropin, so he mentioned FSH, so follicle stimulating, and then luteinizing hormone. POMC peptides, so we'll talk about adrenocorticotropin, beta endorphin, thyroid stimulating, melanocyte stimulating, we'll mention all of those. And then here we have oxytocin and then the ADH antidiuretic hormone, which was the vasopressin. So with this is just kind of a good slide to go back and refer to when studying what hormones come from where. Okay, but let's talk about our next part here with how does the hypothalamus and pituitary influence the thyroid gland. Let me back up. One thing I forgot to mention that you may see on the next quiz or exam is that the anterior pituitary, and you probably already gathered this, releases or secretes 7 different hormones that regulate stress, growth, development, metabolism, reproduction, and exercise response. So 7, where the posterior pituitary only releases 2. It's pretty obvious when looking at this, but just so you know, that's what you need to be familiar with. Okay, now let's move on. Thyroid gland. So we have to talk about what is the process that has to be followed in order for the thyroid to release its specific hormones. The hypothalamus will either promote or inhibit the release of hormones from the pituitary gland by secreting, releasing, or inhibiting hormones. So releasing hormones would increase the secretion or concentration, where inhibiting would stop the release. The thyroid gland, so we have TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. That's secreted from the hypothalamus, and it binds to peptides on the anterior pituitary. So we look here at this picture, we see the hypothalamus, it releases TRH. You have your little key right here, which binds to peptides or peptide receptors on the anterior pituitary here, which will then stimulate secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone. The TSH comes from the pituitary gland, so it's now going to be released from the pituitary and bind to the thyroid. The thyroid is located on the neck. It causes the release of T3, T4, and calcitonin. So TSH will enter circulation, travel in the bloodstream, and then bind with receptors on the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland has the control of mediated feedback by negative feedback, which in turn can reverse the process by stimulating the hypothalamus to release a hormone, so it can inhibit its release of its own hormones. Basically to stop producing T3 or to stop producing T4. Let's talk about what each of these do. So thyroid gland stimulated by TSH. You can see the picture at the top. It's located on our neck. T3 and T4. So there's about 80% of the thyroid hormones are going to be T4, and only 20% of the thyroid hormones are T3. But T3 is 4 times as strong as T4. What do these hormones influence? Basal metabolic rate, growth and development, and then metabolism of macronutrients. So it determines how quickly we metabolize our food. So increasing metabolic rate results in increased weight loss. Where we have decreased metabolic rate, we probably have a little bit of weight gain. So metabolic rate, how much energy you burn at rest, and then how quickly we grow and develop. So that's kind of the main regulation of these hormones here. And then another hormone that's released that was shown on the last slide is calcitonin. Calcitonin is a 32 amino acid peptide. Parafollicle cells that reduce blood calcium levels, and they inhibit osteoclast. So basically they regulate plasma calcium levels. So that means the calcium circulating in our bloodstream. And they block the release of calcium from bone, and they stimulate excretion of calcium by the kidneys. So basically, calcitonin just reduces calcium levels in the blood by 2 main mechanisms. It inhibits the activity of osteoclast. Osteoclast break down bone cells to where calcium is released. And then also, it can decrease the resorption of calcium in the kidneys, again leading to lower blood calcium levels. So that's kind of the main purpose. Let's look at this picture here. So if we see the plus sign, that means positive feedback. That means we are increasing the secretion. So hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone. It binds to receptors on the pituitary, which then releases thyroid stimulating hormone to activate the thyroid gland. Then we have T3 and T4 being released from the thyroid gland, but these use negative feedback to where these hormones can go back and act on the pituitary or the hypothalamus to decrease its secretion when the levels are too high. Now let's talk about parathyroid hormone, because they're located on the back of the thyroid gland. So PTH is an 84 amino acid peptide. It has the opposite effect of calcitonin. This hormone actually increases plasma concentrations of blood calcium. So it promotes calcium being released into circulation. It has an effect on 3 target areas, and if we look at this picture, we can see this. So we see the PTH is going to be released from these glands, and it's going to impact bone. When it impacts bone, it stimulates calcium release from the bone, and we can see that here. And then calcium will get into the bloodstream. Next is the kidneys. So we see how it's going to act in the kidneys, and it actually enhances active reabsorption of calcium into the kidneys. And then the kidneys will then have an impact on the intestine. So it increases the absorption of calcium by increasing production of vitamin D, and then upregulating key enzymes for this process, to where then calcium again is released into the bloodstream. So what is the kind of purpose of this? First, one thing to know is PTH is regulated by negative feedback, in which calcium concentrations result in a decreased production of the hormone when calcium levels are too high in the blood. But why is this important? Let's talk about bone turnover. So bone turnover in part is basically the remodeling process of bone. So it involves reabsorption, which is the normal breakdown of bone by osteoclasts and release of calcium into the blood. So that's a normal process. PTH indirectly stimulates osteoclasts. There are no receptors involved, by influencing precursors. PTH does not bind with osteoblast either, which are important. PTH does bind with osteoblast, which are important for the repair of bone from just everyday stress and exercise. So let's talk about what is the effect of exercise on PTH. So we already know PTH influences bone remodeling, so where the tissue is reabsorbed and rebuilt over time. So it takes calcium out of the bone into the bloodstream, and then eventually it does deposit it back into the bone. But with exercise, so endurance training versus heavy resistance training, this actually helps to maintain and increase bone mineral density by increasing blood concentrations of PTH with high exercise intensity. It also helps to combat the loss of bone with age and osteoporosis, especially if the exercise is a weight-bearing exercise. All right, so next, what we normally would have done would be this critical thinking problem. So this critical thinking problem, if you read it, we can kind of answer it together. 25-year-old male trying to gain muscle mass has increased his caloric intake and started a new resistance training program. So he's eating more and he's lifting weights more. But despite anabolic changes, which are normally a building up effect, he's actually noticed the opposite effect. He's noticed weight loss. So even though he's eating more and lifting weights, he's losing weight. It's probably due, or even though he has an increased appetite, he's losing weight even though he's eating more. He also has not been sleeping very much at night. He's restless due to his increased resting heart rate and tremors. So what condition does he have? Normally we can answer this pretty quickly because based on the slides we just went over. Hyperthyroidism. So hyperthyroidism is excessive production of thyroid hormones. All right, so we said hyperthyroidism. Other symptoms involved with this would be nervousness. So we already said increased heart rate, weight loss, also mood swings. He's not sleeping, so insomnia, and then some anxiety. What causes this disorder? So it's a malfunction of the thyroid gland, and then also maybe the anterior pituitary. So if we looked at his blood profiles, what we would actually see would be low levels of TSH, but high levels of T3 and T4, which would increase his metabolic rate and his metabolism. With hypothyroidism, we would actually see a high TSH and then a low T3 and T4. So with a low concentration or hypothyroidism, the thyroid is basically not making enough T4, and then the pituitary recognizes this and then makes more TSH in an attempt for more T4 to be produced out of the thyroid. And then the opposite happens with a with hyperthyroidism. The thyroid is producing T3 and T4, and the pituitary gland realizes this, so the pituitary secretes less TSH. So that's why there would be a low concentration, because T3 and T4 is already really high. But yeah, so that's really all we have for the thyroid gland, but let's move on to growth hormone. Okay, so we've been mentioning growth hormone. It is a 191 amino acid polypeptide. So where is this made? So synthesized and secreted by somatrophs. So somatrophs are in the anterior pituitary gland. So it's from this this hormone is released from the anterior pituitary. Somatroph is Greek. It just means to nourish. So these cells constitute 20% of the cells in the anterior pituitary. These cells take years to develop and reach full maturity. So these are nourishing cells, and these cells secrete our growth hormone. So let's talk about some of the main roles of growth hormone. So obviously, it is important for growth and development. So as we are born, and as we start to age right around up until age 10, growth hormone is the highest. So growth hormone peaks at age 10, and then it still stays pretty relatively high around age 15. And then as we hit 20, we'll see probably a sharp decline. And then from 20 to 80 or 20 to 70, we'll see a pretty steep decline in growth hormone, because after 20 we stop aging, or we stop growing and developing, so we no longer need high levels of growth hormone. Growth hormone also regulates the breakdown of triglycerides. So what is this called? It's called lipolysis. So prevents the uptake or accumulation of lipids. That means that it prevents fat cells from accumulating. So increase in fat metabolism, basically where the body prefers to use fat as fuel. It spares our carbohydrates, so it's glycogen sparing. So it saves our carbs, it saves glycogen, and it has a direct effect on lipolysis. So it basically burns fat stores. It also has an indirect effect on bone stimulation, and then it also plays a role in protein synthesis. It's also been shown that this hormone may enhance immune function. It also enhances cartilage and collagen formation, and then it increases the retention of nitrogen, sodium, and potassium. So let's look at, growth hormone has an effect on our fat cells. So it has a direct effect on fat. It decreases our fat cells. And then it also has an indirect effect on bone. So we see growth hormone will activate the liver, which will release IGF, which is insulin-like growth factor, which has an indirect effect on increasing bone mineral density and bone tissue. Growth hormone also stimulates muscle protein synthesis, and it's used as a performance-enhancing drug by athletes. Let's talk about why is it really used as a performance-enhancing drug. We already know it decreases body fat, and it increases amino acid uptake into the cell, so it increases muscle protein synthesis. It is also not detected in a blood test. So you can't detect this in a blood test, so that's why it's very popular among, bodybuilders or other athletes trying to see improvements in performance, because we have increased protein synthesis and we have decreased fat mass. So let's look at this picture here. All right, so somatostatin will impact the pituitary gland, so released from kind of the somatrophs. And then we also have GHRN. So that's growth hormone releasing hormone, will cause the pituitary to release growth hormone. It will impact the liver, which will release IGF. So IGF is released from the liver. It's also released from muscle fibers, which we'll talk about later. And it has a direct effect on bone, muscle, and then fat. Let's look over here at ghrelin. So ghrelin is a hunger hormone, and it increases when we are hungry. So it's basically our eating, it promotes eating. So it kind of allows us to be hungry. So let's follow this. Ghrelin actually stimulates the release of growth hormone. So when ghrelin levels are high, growth hormone is released. This will increase gluconeogenesis in the liver. So gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose or glycogen from non-carbohydrate sources in the liver, which will also stimulate protein synthesis and growth. So it increases amino acid uptake in the cells. But it blocks glucose entry into fat cells, and it favors fat metabolism. So it burns fat cells, and it saves the glucose and it saves the carbs. So it makes energy from non-carbohydrate sources like fat. So yeah, that's kind of about growth hormone. But let's look at how does exercise influence growth hormone. So this picture here, I would normally have y'all draw conclusions. I would have you analyze both of these graphs, and then we would discuss it. So we would talk about each one of them. So take just a second to look at this, and then we will talk about it. So it's basically just peak response for growth hormone in males versus females during and after aerobic exercise of different durations, but at 70% of oxygen consumption. So that's what we're looking at here. Few things that we want to point out is females have a higher resting concentration than males, and we can see females in the top, males in the bottom. So females, we see 0, and then we see slightly above 0 is where females' resting concentration is, where males is all the way at 0. So that's one interesting thing to point out. Peak concentration, and the reason is growth hormone fluctuates basically throughout the menstrual cycle in females. Peak concentration is not as high in females though. So peak concentration is a lot lower than it is in the males. But there's no difference in peak between 60 to 120 minutes of exercise between the females, and then somewhat in the males. So between the 30 minutes for both males and females, it's relatively low. And then as we increase our duration, just 30 more minutes, we see a pretty big increase in both groups. But from 60 to 120 minutes, so when running an extra hour or doing exercise for 2 hours, with the females, we see actually no difference. Males, slight increase. Another factor is concentration remains elevated after the 120 minutes. Why is this? To help promote recovery. So we see that it's still elevated in both groups as exercise stops after the 120. So if you look at the 120 time frame and then follow the lines, with the 120 minutes, it's still pretty elevated post-exercise. Again, it helps to promote recovery. And then greater increase with longer duration, elevated post-exercise for greater enhancement in recovery of tissues. So that's kind of our conclusions there. Another factor is light anaerobic exercise actually results in no growth hormone increases. So like high repetition, low load, like a muscular endurance or hypertrophy protocol would actually not produce any changes to growth hormone. There's an intensity threshold that must be reached for growth hormone in order to elicit significant changes. And that may be due to the metabolic connection with glycogen metabolism and fat metabolism. All right, so last slide to discuss for part 2 is growth hormone, is looking at its circadian rhythm. So I mentioned that growth hormone had a pulsatile release, and we can see that in the pictures. So this first picture up here is a normal circadian rhythm with our sleep at this point here, and then as we wake up, we still see slight increases in growth hormone throughout the day. So released in a pulsatile manner throughout a day with highest concentrations while sleeping. Why is this? To repair and recover our body's tissues at night. Aging decreases growth hormone release and decreases recovery after acute exercise. So exercise training can actually improve the acute response to exercise and to the release of growth hormone in older adults. But yeah, so growth hormone highest at night, it promotes healing, recovery of muscle and all of our tissues. But let's look over here. So this bottom picture also looks at growth hormone over like kind of throughout 2 days. We have nocturnal sleep, which means we're sleeping at night, and we see growth hormone is highest when we fall asleep. And then we wake up during the day, and then look at this white spot or the white block here. Nocturnal sleep deprivation. This means we did not sleep during the night. Even though it's nighttime, it's dark outside, but if we are not asleep, growth hormone will not release. But look, daytime sleep, we took a really nice long nap, growth hormone released. So it doesn't matter if it's nighttime or daytime, but when you fall asleep, a normal functioning body will have high release of growth hormone. Again, just promotes recovery and helps the body heal and be prepared for the next day. But yeah, that's all we're going to talk about for part 2. The next video we'll discuss